everyone, welcome back. We are going to go ahead and we are going to go over those last questions. So one of those questions says, why does her pa not believe her about the man in the black cloak? Well, if we go back and we look, it says that her pa kept on, he just didn't believe her. He said that you're reading too many stories. On page 29, it says, but her pa just shook his head. You've had a bad dream is all. You've been reading too many of them ghost stories. So he just thinks that maybe the boredom has gotten to her, that she, like that can't happen. That's not true. You're just making things up. And our second question was, how does Serafina disobey her pa? And it was the last thing that we read. He had told her not to go up the stairs, but that is what she went to go do anyways. It says she began to climb the stairs, and that is kind of where we left off that, because we wanted to see what was going to happen. So, and that last paragraph says that she had to figure out what had happened, and she's talking about she has to figure out what happened to the girl in the yellow dress. That's what she wants to figure out. And so then she began to climb the stairs. So here we go. Page 31 is where we are picking up, and we are picking up right here. Staying as small and quiet as she could, she crept up the steps one by one. A catastrophe of sounds floated down to her. The echo of people talking, the rustling of clothing, dozens of different footsteps. It was a crowd of many people. Something was definitely happening up there. We've got to keep to ourselves, you and I. Her pa's warning played in her mind as she climbed. There ain't no sense in people seeing you and asking questions. She slinked to the top of the stairway, then ducked into an alcove on the main floor that looked onto a huge room full of fancy dressed people who seemed to be gathering for some type of grand social event. Massive, ornately crafted wrought iron and glass doors led into the entrance hall, with its polished marble floor and the vaulted ceilings of hand-carved oak beams. Soaring limestone arches led from this central room to the various wings of the mansion. The ceiling was so high, she had the urge to climb up there and peer down. She had been here before, but had always loved the room and couldn't help marveling at it again, especially in the daylight. She had never seen so many glistening, beautiful things, so many soft surfaces to sit on, and so many interesting places to hide. Spotting an upholstered chair, she felt an overwhelming desire to run her fingernails over the plush fabric. All of the room's colors were so bright, and the surfaces were so clean and shiny. She didn't see any mud or grease or dirt anywhere. There were brightly colored vases filled with flowers. To think, flowers actually inside the house. Sunlight flooded in from the sparkling leaded glass windows of the spiraling 4-story high grand staircase and the glass-domed winter garden with its spraying fountain and tropical plants. She squinted her eyes against the brightness. The entrance hall teemed with dozens of beautifully attired ladies and gentlemen, along with the manservants in black and white uniforms, helped them prepare for a morning of horseback riding. Serafina stared at the lady who wore a riding dress made of white pipe green velvet and cranberry red damask. Another woman wore a lovely mauve habit with a dark purple accents and matching hat. There were even a few children there, clothed as finely as their parents. Her eyes darted around the room as she tried to take it all in. Serafina looked at the face of the lady in the green dress, and then she looked at the face of the lady in the mauve hat. She knew her mama was long dead, or at very least long gone. But all of her life, Whenever she saw a woman, she checked to see if the woman looked like her. She studied the faces of the children too, wondering if there was a chance that any of them could be her brothers and sisters. When she was little, she used to tell herself a story that maybe she had come home one day to the house, muddy from her hunting, and her mother had taken her downstairs and stuck her in the belt-driven washing machine, and then went back upstairs and accidentally forgot about her, just spinning and spinning away down there. But when Serafina looked around at the women and the children in the entrance hall and saw their blonde hair and their blue eyes, and their black hair and their brown eyes, she knew that none of them were her kin. Her pa never talked about what her mama looked like, but Serafina searched for her in every face she saw. Serafina had come upstairs with a purpose, but now that she was here, she thought of the thought of actually trying to talk to any of these fancy people put a rock in her stomach. She swallowed an inch forward a little, but the lump in her throat was so huge that she wasn't even sure she could get a word out. She wanted to tell them what she saw, but it suddenly seemed so foolish. They were all happy and carefree, like so many larks on a sunny day. She didn't understand. The girl was obviously one of these people, so why weren't they looking for her? It was like it never happened. Like she had imagined the whole thing. What was she going to say to them? "Excuse me, everyone. I'm pretty sure I saw a horrible black-cloaked man make a little girl vanish into thin air. Has anyone seen her?" They'd locked her up like a cuckoo bird. As a tall gentleman in a black suit coat walked by, she realized that one of these men might actually be the man in the black cloak. With his shadowed face and glowing eyes, there was no doubt that the attacker had been some sort of specter, but she had sunk her teeth into him and tasted real blood. And he needed a lantern to see, just like all the other people she had followed over the years, which meant he was of this world too. She scanned the men in the crowd, keeping her breathing as steady as she could. Was it possible that he was here at this very moment? Mrs. Edith Vanderbilt, the mistress of the house, walked into the room wearing a striking velvet dress with a wide-brimmed hat. Serafina couldn't take her eyes off the mesmerizing movement of the hat's feathers. A refined and attractive woman, Miss Vanderbilt had a pale complexion and a full head of dark hair, and she seemed at ease in her role as hostess as she moved through the room. "While we wait for the servants to bring up our horses," she said happily to her guest, "I would like to invite everyone to join me in the tapestry gallery for a bit of musical entertainment." A pleasant murmur passed through the crowd. Delighted by the idea of a diversion, the ladies and gentlemen streamed into the gallery, an elegant decorated room with exquisitely hand-painted ceilings, intricate musical instruments, and delicate antique wall tapestries. Serafina loved to climb the tapestries at night and run her fingernails down through the soft fabric. "I'm sure that most of you already know Mr. Montgomery Thorne," Miss Vanderbilt said with a gentle sweep of her arm towards the gentleman. "He has graciously offered to play for us today." "Thank you, Mr. Vanderbilt, Mrs. Vanderbilt," said Mr. Thorne as he stepped forward with a smile. "This whole outing is such a wonderful idea, and I must say that you're a most radiant hostess on this lovely morning." "You are too kind, sir," Mrs. Vanderbilt said with a smile. To Serafina, who had been listening to Biltmore's visitors her entire life, he didn't sound like he came from the mountains of North Carolina or from New York like the Vanderbilts. He spoke with an accent of a Southern gentleman, maybe from Georgia or South Carolina. She crept forward to get a better look at him. He wore a white satin cravat around his neck, a brocade waistcoat, and pale gray gloves, all which she thought went nicely with his silvery black hair and perfectly trimmed sideburns. He picked up a finely made violin and its bow from the table where it had been lying. "Since when do you play the violin, Thorne?" called one of the gentlemen from New York in a friendly tone. "Oh, I've been practicing here and there, Mr. Bindle," said Mr. Thorne as he lifted the instrument to his chin. "When? On the carriage ride here?" Mr. Bindle retorted, and everyone laughed. Serafina almost felt sorry for Mr. Thorne. It was clear from their playful banter that Mr. Bindle and Mr. Thorne were companions, but it was equally clear that Mr. Bindle had serious doubts as to whether his friend could actually play. Serafina watched in nervous silence as Mr. Thorne prepared himself. Perhaps it was a new instrument to him, and this was his first performance. She couldn't even imagine playing such a thing herself. At long last, he set the bow gently across the strings, paused for a moment to collect himself, and then began to play. Suddenly, the vaulted rooms of the house filled with the loveliest music she had ever heard, elegant and flowing, like a river of sound. He was wonderful, spellbound by the beauty of his playing. The ladies and gentlemen, and even the servants, stood quietly and listened with rapt attention. And they let their hearts soak into every measure of the music he made. Serafina enjoyed the sound of his playing, but she also watched his dexterous fingers. They moved so fast over the strings that they reminded her of little running mice, and she wanted to pounce on them. When Mr. Thorne was done, everyone applauded and congratulated him, especially Mr. Bindle, who laughed at him in disbelief. "You never cease to amaze me, Thorne. You shoot like a marksman, you speak fluent Russian, and now you play the violin like the Lottie. Tell us, man, is there anything that you're not good at?" "Well, I'm certainly not as skilled a horseback rider as you are, Mr. Bindle," Mr. Thorne said as he set his violin to the side. "And I must say it's always been most vexing to me." "Well, stop the presses," Mr. Bindle called. "The man has a chink in his armor after all." Then he looked at Miss Vanderbilt with a smile. "So, when exactly are we going horseback riding?" The other guests laughed, and the two gentlemen, as they quipped back and forth, and Serafina smiled. She enjoyed watching the camaraderies of these people, and envied the way that they spoke to one another and touched each other and shared their lives. It was so different from her own world of shadow and solitude. She watched a young woman tilt her head and smile as she reached out and put her hand on the arm of a young gentleman. Serafina tried imitating the gesture herself. "Are you lost?" someone said behind her. Startled, Serafina whirled around and started to hiss, but then she stopped herself short. A young boy stood in front of her. A large black Doberman with sharply pointed ears sat at his side and stared intently at her. The boy wore a fine tweeded riding jacket, a buttoned vest, woolen joppers, and knee-high leather boots. He was a little sickly looking, a little frail even, but he had a watchful, sensitive brown eyes and rather fetching tussle of wavy brown hair. He stood quietly and staring at her. It took every ounce of her courage not to run. She didn't know what to do. Did she think that he was a vagrant servant who had wandered in? Or perhaps she looked like a dazed servant, maybe a chimney sweep or a window washing girl. Either way, she knew that she was stuck. He had caught her dead to rights exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. And that is where we are going to stop today. Thank you for listening.